All right, welcome everyone. Let's get into this. Test management. I've had a career that spanned quite a long time. Did test management in those really bad old waterfall days. Anyone from the bad old waterfall days? Oh, thank God for that. Yeah, those bad old waterfall days when really test management was in its prime. It was a construct of those days, if you think about it. Large, independent testing teams. They were independent, so they couldn't get tainted by the developers and their ideas. And so these large, independent testing teams existed, and often the testing phases, because we had phases then, that occurred were often up to 11 months long. Right? So there's a significant amount of time in which testing was being performed. The teams were often quite large because even though we had such large amounts of time, development was obviously late. I mean, and these things never happen in Agile, I know, but development was often late. And so in order to be able to catch up on time, often we needed to increase the number of people in these testing teams. Test managers, so therefore in that context, often had roughly 3 roles, I see it. Certainly that was my experience. The first role was looking after people, all that people management aspect of these large teams. The second aspect of it was that they were overlooking the test plan and the test strategy. So in a very hierarchical format, they often had testers who were only deemed able to execute test cases. They couldn't think up test cases or develop strategies. Their job was very much performing and executing them. Test analysts, well, they were slightly smarter, and they were deemed to allow to think up test cases and write them. And then the test manager had the overall role of looking at the system from systems perspective and developing a strategy or developing an approach, but also looking at the logistics of how could we actually get 11 months of testing performed. What are the test environments needed to do that? How many people do we need to perform the testing? And so often they were involved in creating milestones and gateways, testing processes, very formalized testing processes with exit and entry criteria and things like that. And so their role was very much about planning and control. And then there's a third aspect of test management, which was about providing visibility to the business. But from a business perspective, testing was often about control. It was about their way of seeing that quality was ensured. And a lot of the ways that were done, and we still use them today, but a lot of the ways that were done was through metrics and the visibility of metrics, the number of test cases executed, the number of bugs found. And this is the way that test managers often convey that information up to the business in that term, in that language. Very, very different in an agile project. We have now much flatter organizations, don't we? I mean, many of us work in cross-functional teams where we work maybe with 6 or 7 developers, and we work with a product owner in that team. We might even have an ops person and a UX person. And so often the tester in that team is reporting to what we call a delivery lead or iteration manager. And so that role, that people role, has largely disappeared. The concept of agile the teams are making decisions. So the decisions are being pushed down into the team. So it's a lot flatter. And that means that the testers within the teams are often making decisions about strategy and what's needed for testing. And so there's no surprise that some people think, has test management, has it ceased to exist? Certainly, Stephen Genoways had that experience. He wrote a blog post about how he was a test manager and ended up working as a delivery lead and the journey that he had. Rob Lambert, same thing. Came in as a test manager, ended up as head of engineering, and certainly had the same similar experience. So I think that it's right for us to question the role of test management, certainly in some of these large tech organizations who really influence a lot of the enterprise organizations that many of us are working in. We know for a fact that a lot of our enterprise organizations are looking at the big tech companies and seeking how do they do things. Large enterprise organizations are concerned about the disruptive technologies companies such as Airbnb, and wondering, well, if that's going to happen to the Hilton, what's going to happen in our line of business, and how are we going to be ready for that? And when it comes to testing, they're looking at all these ideas in Google and Facebook and places like that and saying, well, how can we apply those ideas to our organizations? So I think that we are right to question test management. I'd like to look at an alternative solution or alternative proposition here, and that's test leadership. Because I think there's a huge need in this great, new, exciting, brave world that we're facing for test leadership. Because we need a voice. We need to have a voice at the table. You know, people are making decisions about continuous delivery, DevOps, about cross-functional teams. And often these decisions are being made without a testing representative at the table. So I'd like us to shift away a little bit about this concept of test management and introduce this idea that maybe we all need to be test leaders. So what's the difference maybe? I like J.P. Cotter's idea on this. He says, managers promote stability. Well, test leadership's all about change. It's all about looking to the horizon and seeing what's out there and how is that going to impact my testing? How is that going to impact my organization's testing practice? And how can I help my organization meet the demands of the future that are coming down the road? Let's ground this a little bit. This all sounds very, very futuristic for some. I worked in a small company in Australia called Tyro Payments. And they're not so small. They're 256 people. But they're a fintech company. So that means that out of those 256 people, about 50% are engineers or work in that IT, in that IT space. So it's quite a significant proportion of that company. Incredibly agile. So they do XP as their practice. They look at fortnightly iterations. They're moving to weekly. They've got a continuous delivery pipeline. They have concepts such as microservices, and yet they have a banking license. And so they're delivering core banking platforms to their network every 2 weeks. I think the other aspect of Tyro that's really interesting is that while they have these enormous, wonderful XP practices, guess what? In the corner, in the dark, if you actually got a lamp and brought it with you into the corner of the office, you could see there was 5 testers sitting in the dark. And what would happen was the software would get thrown over the fence to these 5 testers, and they had to test it for 2 days before it got deployed. And so even though they had these wonderful agile practices, their testing was still quite in a waterfall type concept. Now, to their credit, they actually realized that that wasn't great, and that's one of the reasons why they asked me to come in and help them out a bit. And so they had this idea of embedding the testers into their development teams. But the quality practices that they were doing really had to be changed and brought forward. While this was happening, just to give you some sort of idea of what was going on, there were, as I said, a team of 5. By the time we finished up there was about 27 testers. And of those 27 testers, most of them were being hired as we go. So that green line is the rapid growth in hiring testers that was going on at the same time as we were trying to adapt to a new way of working. And this was a new way of working for developers and for testers. So when you look at those brown columns, really those are points when we change something significantly with respect to testing. So in August, one of the things we looked at was to define what it meant to be a Tyro tester. And we got the whole testing practice at that time to really come together and ask themselves what they felt it meant to be a Tyro tester. In November was the time we actually embedded the testers in the team. In February, there was another pivot point where we decided to push a lot of the decision-making down, and so forth. And it just gives you some idea of the context of the changes that were happening, that we had to constantly embrace and readdress how we saw our strategies about what we were doing. And we had to constantly pivot all the time in order to meet the new demands or the new context that was happening. I'd like to talk a little bit about vision, because I think test leadership starts there. One of the visions that I had for the testing practice at that time, and it sounds a little bit grandiose, but bear with me, was to be the best testing practice in Australia. And there's a reason for that, because in Sydney, Australia, we have Atlassian. And maybe some of you are familiar with the quality assistance model, and maybe your companies are very interested in that model. And it's a great model, and I have a great respect for Atlassian. But to give them their due, Atlassian work is basically a massive bug tracking system, right? I'm working in a bank. and I felt that the QA model was wonderful for their context, but I wanted to see, well, what are the real challenges about working in a financial institution where performance and security are such important factors, and that we have regulatory and compliance obligations that we have to meet? How can we reinvent testing in that area, and how can we accommodate the new demands that organizations want us to meet? I also had this vision about every tester being a test lead, and that doesn't mean that they have a role as a test lead, but that they have the poise and the confidence to be able to go into any situation and own that situation. And I think that's the skill set that I'd like every tester to be at least aspiring for. We had a lot of strategy. So vision's great. Let's ground it even more and put it into an overall strategy of how we want to implement that vision. As I mentioned before to you, we had these, at the start of the engagement, we had this session where we spoke about what does it mean to be a Tyro tester. And these are some of the traits that came out of what it meant. So to own your testing, to have autonomy over how you control your testing and your testing process was really important for everyone. But along with that autonomy comes responsibility. And to own that responsibility and to feel that responsibility within the team and help the team take that testing responsibility on. Autodidactic in the sense that not waiting to be fed information. That it's not the tester that sits in the corner waiting to be told what to do, but really that you would go out looking for information and that you find the information that you need in order to get your job done. So you own your own learning. We added self-aware because self-aware, we can't really, without self-awareness, it's really hard to improve as a tester. Being self-aware of our testing process and being, observing what we do and feeding that back into how we do things helps us continuously improve our testing. And finally, without a healthy dose of courage, a lot of this is really, really hard because this is really tough stuff to do. And I think having the courage to try again, to experiment, to make mistakes, to pick up, and to keep going forward and keep moving forward to try out new things takes a lot of courage for everyone. And alongside that, we had all these heaps and heaps of different things that we thought would be really important things for testers to do. I feel kind of weird a little about putting that we have to test software. I think sometimes we forget that, you know? It's like we all got all these other things that we're helping a team in an agile team and we're helping other people. And those are really important things to do. But at the end of it, if we're not testing software, how can we actually start to get a real sense of where the risks are? How can we get a real sense of what's important and to really understand what the product does? It's by getting in there and getting your hands dirty on software that I think makes the difference and makes you constantly aware and your finger on the pulse about what the risks are in the product. Okay, so we had all this thing, that strategy of what it meant for a tester. But of course, there's lots of other strategies out there. And you can see we had a whole heap of them there. Microservices, performance testing, looking at test environments, strategies for hiring people, strategies, lots and lots of different ways of approaching. And when I think about a testing strategy in this context, I'm really looking at how can we approach this problem? What are the risks here? How can we approach these risks? How can we engage ourselves in this situation? What's the most appropriate method of us moving forward on this? And so we developed this method, unconsciously really, of having this SWOT team, where we would identify risks, and we would look at these risks and think about how can we overcome those risks. For example, in performance testing. So we, being a bank and dealing in transactions all the time, performance testing was always high on the list. It was never going to go away. And a huge part of our testing process was to do performance testing benchmark. But we were constantly developing new product all the time, a new product that was being experimented on, so that the product owners would create a concept, and we would develop that concept, we put it out in the market and wait for feedback. Now, if we're looking at that sort of approach, we know that some of our products are only going to be used by 1 or 2 people, potentially at the start. And so performance testing wasn't always a huge part of our thinking up front initially. So I felt that this was a real risk, because really we needed to start thinking about building our performance into our products rather than waiting to discover whether there was going to be a problem or not. And so we talked to the developers about this, and they acknowledged that this was a concern, but it was very hard to get engaged. And so we created our SWOT team, and we built our own test environment, and we created some performance testing in there. And gradually, as we created data and evidence, and people started recognizing the benefit of doing this performance testing early on, they started taking that information and taking the ideas and building it into their own teams. And we discovered that this was a pattern that happened again and again, that by creating the data and making the problem visible, that the teams were then more than happy to go and incorporate that into their context. And so we developed this sort of method of being these constantly looking on the horizon for what's going to be a potential problem in the future. Without motivation, it's going to be very hard for people to keep moving on this. And to help me talk a little bit about motivation, I'd like to introduce you to Jimmy and Bruce, right? Because Jimmy or Bruce are going to explain to me a little bit about the coaching that I worked with the testers on in the teams. So, there's Jimmy. Jimmy's the student. And we have Bruce over here. He's the coach. I have to point this out. The logs. Whoop. And so in Scotland, every summer, there's 6 villages that get together, and they compete against each other. And one of the things that they compete against is carrying these very, very large and heavy-looking logs, 300 meters. And they have to do this. If they drop the logs, they get to start at the beginning again. And it goes on until, I don't know what happens. They either have a heart attack or else they get across the line. But you can see Jimmy here. He's either really, really concentrating really hard, or else he's incredibly distressed. Haven't got my mind made up yet. But Bruce, he's the coach. Bruce he's chilled. He's relaxed. He's there and he's encouraging Jimmy to get across the line. I like to think that Bruce is saying things like, just keep your eyes on the goal. Keep your eyes on that line. You can do it. Or maybe he's saying, keep your shoulders dropped, and he's giving some little tips about how to relax your muscles so that you can sustain carrying the logs for longer. But I like this because it goes to a little bit about the type of coaching that I like to do. And it's about really getting an understanding a tester's motivation. And it's about understanding how can you help that tester be self-motivated to get across the line themselves. Bruces can't carry the logs. You know, it's about helping that student get across and being able to do it by themselves. And that's where the logs come in. And so for coaching, what we're looking at is having these tasks. So everything's concentrated specifically around giving the student or the tester a specific task to do in order to help them learn something new. And it could be lots of very different things. You know, creating a test strategy, something that I come across, not a lot of testers in Agile actually do a lot of strategic thinking in their work. So I find that's a skill set that many testers find useful to acquire. But exploratory testing, you know, modeling a system, looking at a story and being able to pull it apart in order to identify potential risks and concerns in that story. And so making those really concrete and applicable by picking a story that's actually on their board at that time and helping them discover the types of risks that might be in that story. But there's another aspect to this. I went to a talk at Agile Australia, and David Marquet was speaking there. And he was talking, David Marquet is an ex-nuclear submarine captain, that's it, captain. And he basically had, the story goes, is he had the worst submarine in the whole fleet. And he was given the honor of helping that submarine become the best submarine. And one of the things that he did is he went from a system of command and control to actually allowing everyone to make decisions about what they should be doing, which is a very different concept to what you would think. And as I was listening to this talk, which really struck me profoundly, he talked about letting people do just a great job. That you, as a leader, what you can do is provide a great environment for people to thrive. That you can actually create that space for people to learn and to develop. And so one of the things that I took that back and I looked at how can I help the testers on the teams do their job better without actually directly being engaged with them. And some of the stuff that we looked at was having training for the whole team rather than the testers. So we were training testers and developers, having paired sessions with developers and helping the developers better understand what the testers were trying to do. So these sorts of things really started to help the testers have more space in their teams. But if you give people more space to make decisions, they start making their own decisions, which is great. You want that. But at some point, people are going to start making decisions that you don't necessarily agree with. And that's really hard, right? I found it really hard. Because in some ways, you have to be okay with that. In some ways, you have to allow people the opportunity to learn new things. How are they going to learn about what's an important decision and what's not an important decision if you don't give them that opportunity? And so, in some ways, I had to really let go of some of the ideology I had, which I felt was really important. Here's an example. We had one team who had a new developer come in who's passionate about BDD. Now, I'm not a huge fan of BDD. I think in some contexts it might be useful, but I certainly didn't feel in a banking situation where it would have been very useful in the context, so I was pretty skeptical. But we agreed that we would have an experiment, that the team as a whole would try out working in a BDD way, and that they would have the opportunity to determine for themselves whether it was a good idea or not. And so more and more, it's about letting letting go of a lot of the ideas that you might hold dear to you and allow people to explore. But we need to be aligned too. I listened to some of Katrina's Clokey's talk this morning, which was a lot about alignment as well. Who doesn't use Slack these days? But we had 14 different teams. And one of the things that I feel that testers really bring to organizations is they're that glue that connects people. Often I hear stories, and certainly I've experienced this myself, where I've had a situation where I've had a conversation with another tester in a different team, only to discover that they've made a change to the API that I was not aware of. And this is the sort of information that I can bring back to the rest of the team and help them accommodate those changes, or then go and have a conversation with that other team about it. And I think this is so powerful. It's something that we can really bring to a lot of the teams that are distributed. And so one of the things that we used Slack for was to try and keep that communication alive. Even though we were distributed, we still very much wanted to use each other to be able to identify potential risks. And even just practical things like test environments and going into change test data, letting other people aware that they're, changing something in the test environment that's been shared. It became very, very practical and useful. Also had a little bit of fun with these infograms. It was a bit of fun. We explored a bit about how making our information visible in an attractive way to people who weren't necessarily that interested about testing. And so we explored with different ideas about how we might do that. Other things that we looked at was tester retros. And this very much came from the testers who wanted an opportunity to, as a collective, try and find ways of improving our process. What's working, what's not working, what can we do better as a practice that can help us take away? And so we started these monthly retros, which mostly was run by the testers themselves. Knowledge sharing, this is nothing new, but a lot of things like having lunchtime sessions or sessions just after lunch, where a tester might come with some sort of information. It might be product related, like the purpose of a BEX run, how many times it runs a day, understanding the 101 of accounting. People with different information would share that. Or it could be a testing, something specific to actually testing, like performance testing or security testing or something like that. Very much driven by the testers themselves, who are keen to share that knowledge with each other. We also made that open to testers developers and anyone outside who were interested in coming along to those sessions. So it was an open invitation. And tester stand-ups. Now we had tester stand-ups from day one. But what we discovered is the team got bigger and bigger. That graph that kept on growing bigger. We found that it became just meaningless when you've got, even after about 8 or 9, you start getting to the point where it really becomes just a ritual that you're not necessarily adding much value to. You're not getting much value of. So we actually split the stand-ups into 2 different stand-ups. And then we played around a lot with the concept of having those times, that concept of scrum of scrums, that sort of thing. We tried to sort of find a way of sharing the knowledge. I'm going to end with this because I think this is really, for me, encapsulates everything that I feel about test leadership. That we're really looking to the future. We're looking to have organizations prepare for change. And there's so much change coming down the road. I mean, it's quite overwhelming at times. I look at it, how is continuous delivery, how is continuous deployment going to affect testing? How can we, as an organization, how can we as a tester, how can we accommodate really good quality practices within continuous delivery? I don't think we've actually really understood fully how we're going to do that just yet. Certainly we've got some ideas, but how can we do deep testing when someone's delivering software, potentially 10 times a day? And yes, how can we, is it something that we want to integrate into the pipeline, or is this something that we want to build in, or is this something that we want to do, in a sense, become release agnostic and then have some sort of parallel work? there's plenty of ideas out there, but it's like looking at these ideas and being able to incorporate those into how they might impact our teams. Microservices is another area. There's an adage about microservices being easy to develop, hard to test, and a nightmare to support. And certainly my experiences has been that's not far from the truth. How do we look at microservices? Certainly there's lots of ideas from an automation perspective with packed and consumer-driven contract tests and things like that about how can we perform automatic, how can we do integration testing in a quick and rapid way with lots of things, with constant change. But that doesn't necessarily look at the system as a whole. And in my experience, the customer doesn't give a damn whether it's a bounded context or it's an artifact. They just want to get their job done. They just want to do what they need to do. And so we really need to have some way we can look at the larger model and see how we can identify these potential risks and meet them in a way that allows us still to rapidly deploy. One of the things I really like about this quote, though, is this little word. Because this little word helps us. This is often we look at struggle, we think about it in a fearful way. We think, oh, that's going to be really hard. But struggle is where we learn. Struggle is an opportunity for us to learn new things. And if we allow ourselves opportunities to struggle and work through things, perhaps the testers of today can become the test leaders of the future. Thank you very much.
So when you're talking about all testers being leaders or encouraging them to be so, what is your suggestion for helping testers to recognize they do have that opportunity to be leaders and to move testing into that direction, not only for themselves and other testers, but for their team?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about here is confidence, in my experience. I think there's so much talent out there. I think the talent's okay. I think it's helping people realize they have that talent and giving people opportunities to exercise that talent and to highlight the times when that talent is being used well. And I don't think that this is really something that can be hurried. It's a long-term thing that people will suddenly, will or will not, because there's no guaranteed success in any of this, but they will at some point maybe identify a moment where it just suddenly all clicks for them, and they make that decision to take it further and to really go with their ideas and to take it forward and become more confident. And I think it's different for each person. People work in different ways, so it's understanding that, listening to that, and I find being available. I think one of the big shifts for me about test management and test leadership is that test management is about getting things done, whilst test leadership is about being available to and helping people obtain their outcomes. So about being present in their when you speak to them. Just little things like that, and really giving them that space and not rushing them because you've got 10 other jobs that you've got to do, but it's about prioritizing what's important.
That's good. Frank?
As a manager myself, I struggle with my own abilities to back off and not let my employees fail on their own, and not just tell them exactly how I would do something, especially when their failures in the end result in a huge customer-facing problem.
Yeah.
So do you have any guidance there of kind of when to let go and just accept that a customer-facing problem is a huge learning experience, even though it might make me not sleep at night?
Yeah, I so feel that. And I think this is one of my biggest sort of learnings about how I personally, in a personal growth way, was that it was important how I wanted to, I wanted everyone to have their own space, but only if they did what I did. So I think what I learned is about experimentation. I think you have to provide opportunities, allow people to fail in a safe way. Obviously, you have some sort of duty to your organization to deliver quality product, and you can't ignore that and just say, well, we're going to experiment needlessly. So I think, like, for example, the BDD example I gave, that was a controlled experiment that we did for a couple of iterations. And then we had a retro on that to discuss, well, what are the benefits? And the team as a whole decided they didn't really like it as a tool. So, they dropped it. So I think that sort of way enables people to explore in a safe way, certainly. I think, but it's not easy as from your personal sense, because you kind of know that it's not right.
I really appreciate your the vision you had for your testers and becoming test leads. So I work as basically just a tester on a cross-functional team in our organization. We have maybe 4 or 5 of these cross-functional teams. What are some of the key skills that you can encourage me to take back to my company to create more leaders in our testers?
One of the things that I found personally that helped me was a sense of collaboration. So, for example, when I talked about what it meant to be a tester, that wasn't me going and saying, this is what it takes to be a tester. It's like, well, what do we feel and how do we feel about that? So it's involving people from the start and giving them that respect and ability to think about it. Some people have never thought about that, right? And so, you're giving the people and the ability to start thinking about, oh yeah, maybe that is important. What are the aspects? What are the traits? And you're starting to help them to think critically about what it means to be a tester in that context. So allowing people to solve problems rather than offering solutions all the time. Another thing that I found was, and it's similar, but I got to a point in February where the team was growing so quickly that we found that I had all this stuff to do. I was just running around, coaching, hiring people, and my day was just full of running from place to place to place. And I can't work well in that context, and I really had to take a step back and think, this isn't working for me. I want to do all these, I just literally can't. And so in the end, we set up a Trello board, and I put all the things that I do on a day-to-day basis, and I opened that up to the testers. And I said, if you have an interest in any of these, there's no obligation to sign up, but put your name onto one of these tasks and take it and run with it. And so in some ways, that allowed me the opportunity to focus on other things. And it gave them an opportunity to be engaged, be involved, and start owning sharing the responsibility across the team.
Thank you. And on the same topic of key skills for leaders, Amit?
I want to touch actually on the point of starting a meaningful discussion about what does it mean to be a Tyro tester. So how did you start such a discussion? How did you provide for grounds for a meaningful discussion? And is the answer that you found good enough for the entire Tyro testers, or do you have variations between the teams at Tyro?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So initially what we did was, when we looked at what it meant to be a Tyro tester, we put it in the context of hiring people. So if people were to join our team, what would we like them to look like? I think that's a much easier thing to look at rather than say, what do I want me to be, right? And I suppose that's where we started. The other thing we learned as we went on is that we did have lots of different types of testers. And in fact, our strength was in diversity. So one of the things we started looking at is, depending on the context, we would look for slightly different skill sets. So we wanted people, for example, who are really, really good talking to the business and understanding business process, because the bugs at that level are very, very different to the types of bugs that you might have when you're talking to a developer about a particular story. And we found that, for example, functionality would work really well for sales. Functionality will work really well for marketing in isolation and finance in isolation. But then when we put the whole onboarding process together, it just fell apart because we hadn't looked at integrating the process as a business process across the whole organization. So I think that having diversity as a Tyro test, having different types of testers helped us look at that and think about that in different ways.
Okay, and off the Tweeter printer, I've got 2 comments and a question. From Test and Tweet on test leadership. If putting people in a situation where they can make decisions, they start making decisions. Ta-da! And from Agile Chris YYC, he would just like to let you know that they're having a great virtual conference at their office in Calgary. And a real question from Ashpak Attar. What jobs are available for the so-called old test managers in today's agile world? Which jobs should old test managers opt in for now?
Wow. I think, look, there's value in, I'm not sure if old test managers is something I identify. I think I'm an old test manager. I think it's about looking at your skill sets and looking at where can you add value. A lot of maybe some of the planning type things are still really important. It's not necessarily that we want to throw those things out. But I think that if we're looking to accommodate change, which is in the future, that we need to look at test leadership. I've seen a lot of test managers move into delivery and places, things like that, which might have worked for them.
And on the same topic, Kate.
Hi. I'm in a very similar role to you, it seems. I just want to +1 everything that you're saying. To that question, at least what I've seen, I don't think a lot of companies really know the answer to that question. I feel a lot of these skills as test leaders, test managers are valued by companies, but they're not really quite sure where they fit in new paradigms as software development keeps shifting and our role in that software development keeps shifting. So I don't think that's 100% known, which is both bad and good. Bad because that's a little scary, like what jobs are available. But good because you can also just create your own opportunity within that, and that's actually what I'm personally trying to do. So if it's not there, define it for them and be what you feel is important to be in your kind of company. If you're in the more of the test management space, would be my personal opinion.
Thank you. We've got a new tree here.
So you're obviously you're talking about testers being leaders, but you also mentioned that some testers, they just want to do their job and go home. What are your suggestions for trying to encourage a tester to break out of that mold? Because it severely limits their ability to test. It also severely limits their ability to give feedback. How do I encourage that tester to break out of that and to start asking questions and participating?
Yeah, that's certainly there were situations I've had the same experience of. I believe that everybody has to have an opportunity. You have to give people an opportunity to have that goal and to reach for that goal. Certainly, I believe people can do that, and I need to believe that. That's part of who I am. But it's not necessarily means that they're going to take it up. I think that's the first thing that we have to recognize. Some people don't want to do that, and that's okay. But I think that if that we have it to ourselves to give them the opportunity, some of the skills that you're looking at is be able to think about things for themselves. I mean, a lot of people come out of university, school, having their whole lives being told what to do. You know, if you think about your experiences at university, a lot of it's based on sitting here in exactly a situation like this and being fed information rather than how do you solve a problem. And then suddenly you go into your workforce and you're expected to be this amazing critical thinker that's able to address any problem that's put forward at your desk. And it's very hard for a lot of people to turn around their thinking like that. I think one thing that you can do is not offer them solutions, but to ask them questions. What do you think you would do? How would you solve this problem? And trying to get people to start taking ownership for some of the situations, rather than being the silver spoon that feeds them. And that can be hard for us because we have this knowledge, we want to just solve the problem, right? So we have to take a step back and take a deep breath and allow the person to that space.
Thank you. We have a new question, Richard Bradshaw.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for sharing your insights. We appreciate that. It was called Test Management Revisited, but it seems to be very focused on testers, as in testers being a tester who tests, not somebody who does testing. So did these leaders at Tyro have any experience of mentoring or coaching other team members to improve their testing and their quality?
So I quickly flicked through all the activities, but one of the activities on that circle with the autonomy responsibility in there is coaching non-testers. And I mean, a huge part of working on an agile team is sharing information, learning how to work together, doing pair testing with developers, doing pair testing with lots of different types of people. So that was a huge part of what they did as well. But I put it in there, I put the actual testing in there because a lot of the time I see testers ending up as being coaches only rather than doing the testing too. And I think that's a shame because I think we need to keep that practice alive. It's a bit about what Nicholas Carr was saying this morning, that we actually lose that skill set if we distribute it to everyone else.
Okay, got a furthest to the back question.
Hello. Just a little bit more about testers' motivation and in giving them right to make decision. So what's the experience? There were probably testers who didn't want that to make decisions. And did you use that to select better testers or testers that can basically replace you?
I'm sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing. Can somebody repeat that?
So about when you give tester right to make decision.
Yeah.
Some testers does not want to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
And some are better in making decisions. So is this the scale when you select, let's say, better tester or testers that can replace you in the end? Thank you.
My experience is that everyone's capable of making decisions. They get up in the morning, they decide whether they're going to get out of bed or not. We all are capable of making decisions, and we all have to make decisions in our daily lives. I think some of us don't feel comfortable making decisions because, you know, a lot of the time that involves taking responsibility. I think that's challenging. But I think that these are things that you can help people come through. I mean, you know, these are situations if you don't give them the experience to make that decision. And maybe you don't start with, you know, you are now responsible for delivering the entire product on your own. Congratulations, you get to decide whether to release or not. You know, maybe we start on a smaller scale than that, and you start making decisions about your own testing process, for example. Well, what do you think is a good test? What do you think are the potential risks here? What do you think, you know, so allowing them the opportunity to think through those things from their own testing perspective so that they really get to own their testing and they own their testing process. And once they see themselves making decisions in that, they're building confidence. Every day when they make a decision that works out right, they build a bit of confidence and allows them to be more confident about their work and what they do. And that's why I say it takes time, because building confidence takes time.
And on the same thread, we've got Ash.
Just in addition to the confidence and things you're talking about, I just had a personal experience where...
Sorry, Ash, can you hold it up?
Sorry, there we go. Just in addition to confidence and opportunities that you were just talking about, personally I can say that one of the best things that I could have received was support, and it was unconditional support of me making those decisions. So I think when you are a leader, and I do this to people now that I mentor, it's always empowering them, giving them the confidence, but also standing by their decisions, even in the instance that there is the case where they fail. Because we, as a testing group, need to be collective. We need to be, united as we continue to move forward in our testing process. And it's all learning for everyone, regardless if you fail or if you're successful.
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Tash.
And on the same topic, sorry, Fiona.
Thanks, Rich. So I feel like we're talking around something that's implicit here in the model you're talking about, which is, you've got testers as leaders, and they're the people who are out there on projects. Who's their leader? You were their leader in your job. Kate is their leader in her job, as I understand it, a huge. But in a lot of organizations who say, we don't need no test managers no more, who's their leader?
Well,
How are we going to make that happen and give it a legitimacy that I think it has lost in the agile paradigm?
So my experience is, and I can only speak from my experience, Fiona, is that I started in the test management role. I ended up as head of engineering, right? And my role was head of engineering / testing. So in some ways, I think that, and what we might see is that as more test managers move in those sorts of directions, you'll see information and skill being shared. But yeah, I agree. I don't really have an answer for how that's going to happen. There's a lot of skill in this room that can help get people help organizations to be there. I think a lot of the work we should be doing is helping those organizations.
Same thread.
I've seen a rebound in organizations I've been at too, where they've gone agile. They've lost testing as a leadership, or they never had it, and they see that it is lost, and it's still a distributed model of people. And I went into one organization where they felt that they didn't have enough leadership to mentor testers in new skills, to figure out what the processes were, and to give them the sense of teams. So I think that it will, in some places, swing back. That I can reassure you that at least in one it has done that. But then I got laid off and they didn't replace me.
Okay, we've got a few off the Twitter printer. Just going back one, Veritax says there's a huge question around responsibility, and that it is always in a direction to whom or what. In other words, it's highly contextual. Veritax also has a question. What do you say to the tester who's trying to take leadership / autonomy of their own work when they are interrupted or directed elsewhere?
I'm not sure how to, that sounds very contextual. So I think that one of the things I looked at, and when I realized when we took the whole thing about the space and about creating an environment, and I realized nothing works if the team's not on board. It's not going to work. There's a lot of things in an organization that are going to block. My experience at Tyro was very fortunate to have a lot of autonomy and a lot of ability to help the engineering teams look at their own testing practices, which were actually pretty good. So I think it's working with non-testers as well to help them understand how the tester needs to have that space and to try and do that work in the background to enable a tester to be allowed to have that choice.
Okay, and we're down to the final 30 seconds. So in 3 words or fewer, the test doctor would like you to answer this question. What do you think are the psychological threats to good test teams and leaders?
Psychological threats?
You've got 3 words.
I don't know.
Perfect. And we'll finish there.